Werewolf here. Soren Kierkegaard is regarded as the founder of the philosophy that would later be known as Existentialism. I can only describe his views as those of extreme individualism, which is what drew me towards his body of work. In his early days as a student, he attended a class taught by one of the most famous names in Western philosophy, Hegel, and interestingly, Karl Marx was also in that same class. And while Hegel said that the individual is a mere unit of greater parts of the society in which they exist, Kierkegaard said the opposite. He decided he was going to do things his own way. Philosophy, he said, should not be archaic, esoteric doctrines on things like what is knowledge, but to be useful, philosophy should be a guide on how we should live our lives. Hegel, he said, was a great philosopher, but would be an even greater philosopher if he had not taken himself too seriously. While Marx went on to preach collectivism and being subservient to your collective communist society, Kierkegaard was largely the opposite. He distrusted groups. Any societal group would inevitably misconstrue whatever its original intentions were. He said that the individual reality was the only reality. As a person deeply committed to his Christian faith, he said that the church in his day as an institution was all wrong, and that it was largely fake. He said that the only relationship with the divine was a personal relationship, and he rejected outward displays of faith as being meaningless. He went as far as to suggest that if Jesus were to return in his day, that members of the church and the clergy would actually be afraid to meet him, because deep down they understood that most of what they said was about upholding their own pretensions and not about true faith. Perhaps the most important tenet that occurs in his writing is the idea of choice. In every situation, you usually have at least two choices. Granted, in some cases, your options may be absolutely horrible. This is essential in his distrust of the masses and his idolization of the individual. You can go with the flow, you can follow the expectations of everyone around you, and if things don't turn out the way you thought they would, you can say, well, it's what we were all doing at that time. The path of the individual is the one of true freedom, and it is easy said, but difficult to do. You make your own choices. The downside is anxiety, a dread of the unknown consequences. And if things go wrong, the burden of blame falls upon you. Still, he insisted, this was the path you should follow if you ever wanted to achieve true self-actualization. Now, he lived in times that were, in many ways, not unlike our own. He lived in what was essentially the beginning of the era of mass communication. Transportation was relatively quicker. The telegraph, newspapers, opinion pieces, fiction, and all sorts of media were emerging. Now, when you think about that, in many ways, we live at what might be the pinnacle of that time. Most people, he insisted, merely held the opinions that they acquired vicariously through these forms of media, and only the true individual challenged or injected any kind of critical thinking in what they were told by any respected source. In his works, his essays, his fiction, he would always leave space for the reader to draw their own conclusions. His ideas were later appropriated by philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre, and soon became referred to as existentialism. By now, there are so many variances of that philosophy that you could argue the word existentialism no longer has any kind of meaning. While Kierkegaard's worldview has an underlying sense of bleakness to it, I suggest a more optimistic interpretation could be derived. He addresses themes such as boredom, depression, irony, diminishing returns of pointless repetition, and as I said before, anxiety. And while he acknowledged these as something that drive down the human spirit, he also acknowledges that they serve a purpose in forcing the individual towards an internal confrontation. And should they succeed in overcoming these things, then they've pushed themselves towards a higher level of consciousness. In the same manner, if you feel that your society or your current culture is dragging you down, you, as long as you have some semblance of choices, can always act as the individual and become a greater individual and change yourself. I would recommend his work, digging into his body of work as a possible reference point and source of ideas for what you need to do. Well, if you like this video, I implore you to subscribe, and until next time, life, liberty, and